Namaskar, my name is Shagun Bhutani and I am a voluntary guide at the National Museum, New Delhi. The National Museum, some of you might not know, was established in the state rooms of the Rashtrapati Bhavan as early as 1948 with a small collection of Indian artifacts that had earlier traveled to London for an exhibition. Even in its small avatar, in the rooms of Rashtrapati Bhavan, the museum made a popular exhibit, and this venue was established in 1960. Subsequently, with contributions from the Archaeological Survey of India, other state museums and private donors, the National Museum now has a formidable collection of about 200,000 objects of art that spread across all the genres of art. Indian tradition depict the human form in its ideal look, showing mostly divinities, superhuman gods and goddesses in various moods and attitudes. Crafted to perfection in prescribed measurements, they often inspire and evoke awe in the spectator. And not only awe, but also the transmission of divine benediction. We glimpse, or as we say, we get the darshan of the divine. All these pieces are sculpted with mindfulness, a focus on all details, so that even a medium like stone, brimming with symbolism, almost alive with movement, becomes a vibrant narrative of the human story and its connection to the divine. The human body in Indian thought and aesthetics is always celebrated in all its forms. So you have it in the perfect shape, you have dwarfs, you have corpulent beings. So it's always celebrated, never negated. The reason is because we consider in the Indian thought that this body is the only vehicle through which we live out our karma and also get a chance to expand our consciousness, achieving evolved spiritual states. Now, was this perfection in the art of sculpture a contribution of a particular individual artist? Was it left to the expertise, the discretion, or even to the whims of an individual? The answer is no. The Indian tradition had codified instructions, many instructions for the smallest detail in any art form. And this was passed as oral tradition from guru to shishya, from generations to generations. One was supposed to be learning this with honesty and a feel of surrender. It then became an indelible part of your sensibilities. It took you deeper into your craft. And when you reached that deep, profound state, you also reached the space where your consciousness expanded and you were fit to portray the divine for the spectator as well as for the artist himself. So out of the many texts, I would like to make a special mention of the Vishnu Dharmottara. It was a supplement to the Vishnu Puran, written sometimes compiled between the 4th and the 7th century. And out of its many chapters, it has one called the Pratima Lakshan, which gives detailed instructions on creating images. So today, when I walk you through the galleries of the National Museum, looking at a few of these pieces, which are narratives of our beliefs, our culture, the stories we heard growing, everything. But here I'd like to underline a fact. The Vishnu Dharmottara, in its text, speaks of the interconnectedness of the arts. And today when I take you through, I'm not doing it as a scholar, but I do it as a dancer. Because I do practice Odissi, and I'm a dancer by profession. Odissi, as some of you may not know, is from Odisha, the eastern state. In ancient times, it was the area of Kalinga. And as a form of dance, it is the one that most closely embraces the fluidity of sculpture in its movement sensibilities. So when I look at a sculpture, at once I relate to the movement, and the kinesthetic memory of my dance comes alive. The way they stand, the slight deflection of the torso, which gives the body its elegant line and expressiveness, the way the feet are placed on the ground, the expressiveness of the hands and how they aid in communicating. For me, the sculptures are not merely standing, they are dancing. And here I'd like to talk about another text, the Natya Shastra, which was compiled in the sometimes around the 1st and 2nd century CE. And like the other texts which instruct sculptors and artists, the Natya Shastra is an instruction manual for dancers and actors on theatre basically, and dance and music was an integral part of theatre. So the actor and the dancer is given a vocabulary, a movement vocabulary for all the parts of the body. Each part, the head, the neck, the eyes, the hands, the feet, the torso, everything has its own repertoire and scope of movement and uses. So when I look at the sculptures, I feel or I know that the artist or the sculptor who carved this had an awareness of the body parts and the scope and its movement, and therefore they were cognizant of the grammar of the Natya Shastra. As a dancer, when I look at sculpture, I feel that the body in dance and the body in sculpture, when what both the artists do is that they want to show or for the spectator to feel the infinite through the very finite human form. So now I begin this journey with you to illuminate points of movement and the presence of hasta mudras in many of the sculptures that we will see. I begin first with the image of a female devotee from the archaeological site of Sibsagar in Assam. And she stands in the Anjali Mudra, which in India is how we greet people. Her head and her eyes seem downcast and bent. The bent posture of her body, the knee is slightly bent, the hip is slightly deflected, adds to the softness of her being. The Anjali Mudra, which we are very familiar with in India as a gesture of greeting in dance, is created with the confluence of two single hand gestures, which is the Pataka. We join them to make the Anjali. It is a sign of recognizing divinity in everything and in anyone who you greet. It is also the way the right and the left part of our bodies meet. So on a subtle level, this enhances the flow of energy. Now, as we move into the first inner space of the museum, we behold the image of Surya standing steady in its grandeur. I would like to apologize if there is some extra noise. There is a bit of renovation going on in the museum, so it may be a little bit disturbing, but we will overcome it as we move inwards. Before I talk about the movement of Surya, I would like to talk about how the body is treated in Indian dance. So the basic idea, the first idea, is to treat the body as a mass that is divisible through the center. So on the physical, tangible level, we have a spine which is in the center, and on the subtle levels, we have the Sushumna Nadi, at the base of which stays the Kundalini. So the first posture in dance, and I would like to just remove my shoes, is the Samabhanga. And the Samabhanga does not merely mean to stand straight. It means that the weight of the body is equally distributed on both sides of the body and on both the feet. So it is a feeling with great rootedness and a very profound flow of energy from the ground and the sacred earth, as it were, into your body. Coming to the image of Surya, Aditya, Bhaskar, countless names of the sun god, who is a very important god in the Indian pantheon. And also, he was worshipped the world over since ancient times. This particular image of Surya is a 13th century image from the Sun Temple at Konark, Orissa. And if ever you have seen the sunrise, you can feel the steadfastness, the steadiness, and the equanimity with which the sun rises and shines upon the whole creation. So Surya stands in Samapad. His head, because just like the body, the head too has a position called the Samam, which is again straight. The eyes too have something called the Samadrishti, which is a very straight, calm look. So if you see the image of Surya in that context, in the context of movement, it is summer all through. Also, the arms, the forearms are sort of mutilated in this image, but he holds two lotuses, and that is again an equal measure of movement. So what does the element of summer in the sculpture of Surya underline? It underlines the equanimity, the steadfastness, the steadiness, and we always say that the sun shines equally on total creation, doesn't differentiate. And I think that quality comes through with this very exquisite sculpture from Konark. As we enter the main corridor, which will lead us to the inner rotunda of the museum, we will meet two exquisite, splendid figures of Goddess Saraswati and Mohini the Enchantress, who was a form that Vishnu took to destroy the demon Bhasmasur. Imperial sculpture in marble of the Goddess Saraswati, who is the goddess of learning and knowledge. I will introduce you to the second body posture in dance. So we spoke about Samabhang, which is the equal. The second one is the single deflection. So physically we merely do it by the bending of one knee and putting the weight on one leg. And it is a very natural posture. If you see people holding babies or ourselves holding a weight, it's a very normal posture that a human body slumps into. And in dance, it sort of offers a degree of softness to the image. And I think that softness is playing here in the image of Saraswati as the mother goddess. We have her abhang, the body, the torso slightly shifted to the left. And what I would like to point out is the Varada mudra in the right hand, which is the mudra of giving. The gods hold either in Abhay or in Varada, sometimes both. But this exquisitely crafted sculpture has her in Varada with the beads, and in the other hand she holds a lotus. The lotus is symbolic of purity, of not being tainted by the dirt around you. So it is a very important symbolism in the sculptural traditions in India. Here she holds a manuscript, which is the symbol for knowledge, and the kamandalu, or the pot holding the sacred water. And for me, this hasta is also the kataka mukha, which we also use in dance to, when we show, picking things or holding things, or even an arrow, we use this hasta. So for me, the hasta is kataka mukha, which further reaffirms my belief that the sculptors did know the vocabulary of dance. Present times, where the whole world has faced these extraordinary circumstances, these corridors which were full of people have seen but a few, and to me all these figures look as though their solitude is amplified, and they are waiting once again for the crowds to come in so that they can joyously proclaim their own stories. We walk to the second sculpture that I would want you to see, is that of Mohini, the form that Vishnu took of the beautiful woman for the destruction of Bhasmasur. And this is from Karnataka, and it is in the style of Western Chalukya. It is also from the 12th century. And again, there is, I think even to a lay person, there is a lot of movement, and it brings me to the third posture that I would like to talk about. So, we spoke about the Samabhang, we spoke about the Abhang, and the third one is the Tribhang. So with the three bends in the body, 1, 2 and 3. And this is the most stylized posture. It has many variations. We can see that Mohini herself is standing not in a plain Tribhang, but in a foot that we would call Dhanupad. And Dhanu means a bow in Sanskrit, and the shape of the leg emulates that of a bow. So Mohini here is in this, and she, again the torso, the movement of the torso that I speak about is to the right. So when you shift the torso to the right, it gives the appearance of the hip coming out on the left and gives that accentuated curve to the body. Her hands, she holds the mirror. So in Odissi, we have a whole series of postures which we call Darpani, and it is a woman holding the mirror in various attitudes. So here she holds it in her left hand, and the elbow rests on her hip. And here is the other hand is stretched across on her forehead to possibly signify the mark on the forehead. And so whenever the woman looks into the mirror, there is always an element of vanity with which she looks, admiring her own beauty, as it were. Also, the other thing that I would like to point out when you look at a sculpture, that each part of the body in India generally, and especially in the sculptures, is ornamented and adorned. When we dance, we wear similar layers of costumes and jewelry, and sometimes too, somebody who doesn't know, it would seem like a bind. But as you grow into the experience of art, you realize that the reason why each part is adorned, because each part is given special attention, and that's why you have an ornament for each part of the body. I would like to show you the earrings that she's wearing, and I think they are just exquisite. And somebody had once in their lecture also spoken about how, also if you see the fall of the beads, you can even see the movement in the beads and how they fall over a full bosom of a woman. So these are the details. Of course, she's under a mango tree. The beauty of the mango tree highlights her own beauty. We are now standing outside the gallery that showcases the Indus Valley civilization. And this, I think we all know, was the oldest civilization that was found in this part of the world and in India. as we go in, of course, the Indus Valley people, the Harappan civilization, it's known for its sophistication in technology, in being a very urbanized civilization. But for me, it also depicts and it also leads us to the beginning how movement was viewed in this part of the world. The object we've just seen is one of the seals of the Indus Valley civilization. The seals in themselves were works of art. They were intricately made and detailed. But the one we just saw was, again, something to, for me, I want to highlight the way the body is. And you see the first evidence of a yogic posture. Some yoga scholars also would say this is the first evidence of the Mula Bandha, which is one of the three main bandhas they practice in yoga. And it is also Pashupati, so it is a form of proto-Shiva, because Shiva is also supposed to be like a Pashupati. He is the lord of all beings. And if you see the animals around this figure, it is he reflects the same sensibility. But for me, the focus is how he sits in the Sukhasana, the posture that the yogis use for meditation. As we move along, we come to the iconic dancing girl, tiny in size, but shouts loudly again about how they treated movement when they depicted it, at least for art's sake, because these are sculptures of that time. And for me, again, the dancing girl depicts the Tribhang, not in a very evolved way, but the way her hand is placed and the deflection, the bend of the leg and the turn of her head, which again sort of reflects an attitude which is very typical of the Tribhang. The showcase window of the Harappan civilization, which shows little figurines in terracotta, and you can see a little male figurine sitting in a yogic posture, and the hastas are again in the Anjali Mudra, which we saw earlier in the later sculpture of the 12th century. So this is, for me, the first evidence of the Anjali Mudra. The mother goddess, another figure, and again in Samapad, so the beginning of Samapad. I would like to bring your attention to this figure of a pregnant woman, and just to highlight that the fact that I earlier said that the body is celebrated in its all forms and all moods. So you have even a figure of a pregnant woman being sort of celebrated through a sculpture of that. I'm just walking in front of a coping stone from the Vedika, from the stupa at Marut. And though the whole stone is very beautifully carved, I would like your attention on these two dancing figures. And I'm sure all of you have probably seen our traditional dance forms and how similar they look. It just sort of connects the strand. What I like to do is connect the strand from now to then. And 2,000 years back to now seems like a very pretty strong strand. Again here, we have the pillars, the vertical stones of the pillars, and we see a couple from the Shunga dynasty, and you can see the way they stand. And this, in its stylized version in dance, would be Prishtadhanu. So we did Dhanu, which was, I'd like to just show it, which was the foot in front in which Mohini was standing. And this is a casual Prishtadhanu. The original would be in dance, would be this. But here it's just somebody standing casually like this. We are now entering the gallery of the Kushan dynasty. And the Kushans were a dynasty that came in from Central Asia. In India, they had two capitals. One was Mathura, which we are all familiar with. The other, the northern capital, was Gandhar, now in Afghanistan. And this is the 1st century CE. It is almost about 400 years after Buddha lived. And this was the first time that we see an image of Buddha. I walk towards the image of a standing Buddha in the Gandhar art style of the Kushan period, which is the 1st century CE. And the figures, of course, carved in grey schist, which was a stone in which the Gandhar sculptures were usually carved. We could also see that it is very inspired by Roman art in the way the face looks. The feel of the Sanghati, which is the robe that Buddha covers himself, it almost feels like a Roman toga. You can see the beginnings of an abhang even here. So basically the abhang is a posture that we use in Indian dance, but it is, and I like to keep emphasizing that it is a very normal human stance of standing. So we see the abhang, though not in a very Indian style, but we see it. And this, I'd like to bring your attention to this part. And normally sculpture, they would carve the whole arm in later times. But here they have not. They would just carve the hand, which is again the Pataka Hasta in dance. And when you see it on a divinity, it depicts the Abhay Mudra, or the boon of fearlessness, which the god grants to his or her devotee. So you can see the style, the technicality of way the sculpture was made, and perhaps in my sort of understanding, it could very well be because the arms are very delicate, and if sculptures were made for transporting from one part to the other, and there was a danger of this breaking, I think they may have evolved this technique just to avoid that. This is the Mathura art of the Kushans, and though the Gandhar art of the Kushans represented mostly Buddhism, the Mathura art represented all the 3 major religions of India at that time, which was Buddhism, Jainism and Brahmanism. So she is Lakshmi, and she is not the Lakshmi that we are used to seeing now. This is an image of Lakshmi as a mother, and you can see her holding her breast in the act of feeding as a mother would. And again, the stance is abhang. Her face looks down gently, her eyes half closed, and you can almost feel the tenderness of the mother looking at her child. The very well-known folklorist and scholar A.K. Ramanujan once wrote an essay to say, is there an Indian way of thinking? And I would like to say, is there an Indian way of standing? And for this, I want to show you 2 panels of sculptures of relief. The one behind me is a 3rd century CE panel from the Ikshvaku dynasty, and it shows the birth of Buddha. And as we dwell on each figure, we see a figure standing. Here is Maya Devi, who's standing for the birth of Buddha, and again you see the Prishtadhanu. Indian, I would like to show this. I think that the delicacy is greatly enhanced, and you actually see this very delicate way of standing if you observe people, not so much in the cities, but if you go out and you observe people in the villages who are still very connected in a sense to the earth and the way they do their work. You would see the similar sensibility of postures and the way they stand. And now we'll go to another panel, which is again from the Gandhar art of the Kushans. And as we said earlier, that it is very influenced by the Roman, Greco-Roman style of sculpture. It shows the escape of Nanda, and again we would like you to dwell on the way the standing, the people are standing, and you can see a marked difference in the way it's depicted here and the one we just saw from the Ikshvaku dynasty. We are now in the period of the Guptas, which was the 4th, 5th century CE, chronicled as the golden age in Indian history. And you may have seen the images, the terracotta images of the river Ganga and Yamuna. Just a few words on terracotta. It was the common man's medium of expression. Stone needed rich patronage, but terracotta, as we all know, is available to the common man and is a medium of their expression. Yet these two are exquisitely made with detail given to their costume, their expression, their hairstyles, their ornaments. I think they are exemplary examples of terracotta sculptures. So the river goddesses we find a lot at a certain period through the pan-Indian sculptural tradition. Again, for me, I'm highlighting the movement, and this, it's very beautiful the way the sculptor showed the fluidity of water through a standing image of a woman. And this is again, if you see, it's something like an abhang, but the extra bend of the knee and the foot being a little at the back of the other foot accentuates the curve and almost the falling feel of the figure, which reflects perhaps the falling and the undulating qualities in the flow of water. This gallery showcases the stone sculptures of the Gupta period, and right at the end we see an image of Vishnu. In the Gupta period, the sculptors were very conscious of the fact that the devotee, this was the first time a devotee would be seeing a tangible, concrete image of their gods in a visual form. So they went an extra step, and in the hallmark of Gupta sculptures is that you can feel the emotions. Also, if you chronologically, that time was the Gupta period was when the arts were flourishing too. The theory, the practice of theatre, literature was all at its peak, and this was the time that the theory of the Navarasas, or the 9 basic sentiments, was being drawn upon. Though the Navarasas first find mention in the Natya Shastra, the 36th chapter of the Natya Shastra, and it is basically rasa for us in common language would mean the juice. But what is rasa? It is the way emotions are treated in art, and it is not only coming from the artist, it is the flow of emotions, of feeling between the artist and the spectator. So it is also the subjective treatment of a piece of art, how the spectator views it, what is the evolution of the person who is looking at the art. And it is, the rasa is also the experiencing of rasa is a meditative experience in which you forget yourself, and both the artist and the spectator sort of unite in that universal sea of consciousness. So it is just not feeling, it is a very profound form of feelings and emotions. So when we look at the Vishnu, I'm sure one has seen him many times, but focus on his expressions. There is again, of course we don't have his lower part, but I think it would have been in Samabhang again. It would have been in Samabhang. Vishnu, normally when you see him as Vishnu, he's very often depicted in Samabhang. It's only in his forms as Krishna and Ram that the foot positions and the body stances start to play around. The face is what I wanted to focus on, and it is depicting the rasa of Shanta and compassion. which the gods should have. So I'll briefly explain you the Navarasas. There is Shringar. So Shringar is something just beautiful. This the beauty of everything is Shringar. Then there is compassion, which is sort of empathy, sympathy for all living entities. So that is Karuna. It's called the Karuna Ras. Then there is Bhaya, the element of fear. Then there is Hasya, laughter, the comic element. There is anger, Raudra, Vibhatsa, the feeling of disgust. Veer, the heroic. Adbhuta, the feel of wonder. And the last, in which everything dissolves, is Shanta, peace. So the gods who have everything in them always reflect Shanta in their absolute forms, and compassion, because that is what a devotee seeks. So this, the face of Vishnu, for me, reflects calm, of course, and a very loving gaze towards the devotee. So what we see here, surprisingly, is an image of Yama, the god of death. Dreaded death for most of us mortals. But here he's again seen, in dance again, if you talk about something horrific or something that is not very pleasant, the posture would always reflect that. So, since we think of Yama as always coming to take away the souls, for me it would be something like that. But here he is standing again in a abhang, and I think that has softened his whole stance. And he sort of in one hand he holds or he speaks to a bird. I think the bird that is associated with Yama is either a crow or a pigeon. And he holds his staff, of course, with the skull here. So, which is, but for somebody who is sort of has conquered death, like Yama was supposed to be the first being who experienced death. Because it is sort of put complementing a pleasant thing, that loses its severity. And the deflection of the hip makes it a very leisurely pose that Yama chooses to stand in this particular sculpture. Before we move on to the gallery that exhibits the bronze sculpture, and we meet the Nataraj, the bronze Nataraj, which is a figure that's known the world over, I would like to show you, standing in one corner of this gallery, an interesting depiction of Nataraj. The head is not there, but we can see the legs. And normally the leg of the Nataraj that we know, the left leg is lifted and crossed over on the right. But this one stays firmly rooted on the ground. Again, in a kind of a extended or a atibhang, as we would call it. So it is a tribhang, but in a larger way, which is a more masculine depiction of the tribhang. His left hand, of course, extends over towards the right. And Nataraj means the god of dance. And here you can see the musician. So you see the percussionist, and you see somebody playing the harp. And it is a sculpture actually from the Pratihar dynasty from Rajasthan. And in the north, you would have the tabla. So there is a pair of drums here. I stand beside an image of the 22nd Jain Tirthankar Neminath, and it is an 11th century sculpture from the Chamana dynasty again. I would like to talk about his, again, the mudra or the attitude that his body is in. Now, most of the time when we see images of Tirthankars, they are either seated in Padmasana or the Sukhasana, or they are standing like this, and this mudra or the attitude of the body is called Kayota Sarga. And what does Kayota Sarga mean? See, again, it is Samabhang. The feet are in Samapad, they are equally placed on the ground. But the mudra of Kayota Sarga, which is the attitude, which sort of affects the energy flows within the physical body, is Kayota Sarga. And Kayota Sarga means Kaya is the body, and Utsarg means to leave the body. And this is because the Jain Tirthankars were rooted on this earth to guide people, but then they always evolved for a higher spiritual, or they belong to a higher spiritual realm. So Kayota Sarga Mudra and the hands extended on the side, they're just not, when you do this physically, it's not just that the hands are straight by the side, you're actually working to pull yourself down. Starting from the feet, you root yourself, and only the upper body is trying to rise up, but everything else is pulling you down. So you're trying to leave the body behind and evolving for a higher spiritual plane. So this is the mudra called the Kayota Sarga Mudra. And you can see the detailing of the fingers, of again the face is beautifully chiseled with that very, the Shanta Ras exuding, the Shri Vatsa symbol. And of course this Tirthankar belongs to the Shvetambara sect, because you can see that he is clad in a dhoti. His symbol is the conch, Neminath's symbol is the conch, and there you see the conch. So this is the Nataraj that we are all familiar with, the Chola bronzes. It's of course in bronze because we are in the gallery of bronze sculptures. And the Nataraj it's a phenomena that's for me surpasses creativity and reaches it at its peak, because it is the human form given to the cosmic grandeur. And of course it is Shiva. We see, and how we see the movement, he's again, the right leg is rooted, the left is lifted off, and sometimes this also can represent the rootedness, as we saw in Neminath, the rootedness on this earth, and the lifted legs shows you a way of freedom. The Abhaya Hasta on his right is again the boon of fearlessness, and the left points to that, the freedom that you have, and the Apasmar, who is the dwarf who represents ignorance, who can't be killed, because if you kill ignorance, there will be only knowledge, and so no value for knowledge. Again, you can see the movement. The jatas, which are spread out, is not because they are made. They also depict, like when somebody is dancing in frenzy, there is the movement of the hair, and the water in the Ganga is being splashed around, as it were. The cycle, which is a very it's a very profound concept in Indian thought, especially of creation and destruction, is showed. But for me, again, the roundness of the arms and the fluidity of movement comes out through all his gestures, the way the fingers are, the way he holds the fire, the drum. The damru is normally held like that when you play it, so you see that. And also if you see the back, we almost always ignore the back, how the back looks, but if you see the back, it has a similar power of movement. Krishna, so we've seen Vishnu in the very in the pose of Samabhang. Here we see him in the avatar of Krishna, and Krishna was a great artist. He inspired artists of dance, music, painting, sculpture. And again we see another position of the foot. So in the Nataraj it was lifted. Here it is lifted like that. And this is, in Odissi, it's a very common posture called Ekapad. So this is him, and his hand reflects that, and it is Suchi. So you see the hastas in the bronze sculptures, you tend to see the hastas more clearly. They're given more definition. And this is the suchi. This hand is the dola that we use a lot in dance. So again, the dancing figure of Krishna, of little Krishna. This comes to the end of my lecture session, in which I try to show you movement. And I hope I leave you with the thought that the sculptures here, the few that we saw and the many that we have not, are a source of infinite contemplations. They have multiple layers of information for somebody who's a true seeker, as it were. And we started our tour with Anjali, and we end it with another Anjali, a devotee, in bronze this time, with the hands joined together in reverence. Thank you.